Greetings, fellow humans. My name is Alistair Lord, and welcome to the Renaissance Yorkshireman interview. Today, I'm talking with a former colleague, James Lamont. We used to work together at York University at the International Pathway College, the IPC, and we used to teach a lot of very similar students. Most of them were Chinese students, and most of them were taking courses in academic English so that they could then go on to do master's degrees afterwards. So, James, would you like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your background in teaching?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm James Lamont. I worked with Alistair in the IPC at the University of York, which, as he already described, was about getting students ready to take their master's degrees or ready to take an undergraduate degree. So I've been teaching English as a foreign language in various forms for about 11 years now. It's a bit of a shocker when you think about it, really. So I've been working, I started off working in France, then I moved back to the UK, and then I went off to Japan. I thought I was going to go to Japan for 1 year, but I ended up staying for 6.5 because Japan's like that, as I'm sure, a lot of EFL teachers will be quite familiar with. So then I moved back to the UK and started working at the IPC. I've been there since 2018. So we're coming on 3 years at the IPC now. Right. Again, a bit of a shocker, but there we go.
Yeah. So, I mean, we must have started around about the same time.
Yeah. I remember I met you like about 2 days in.
Right.
Yeah.
But I stopped working there. My contract expired, about 18 months ago now. So your experience in Japan, I mean, how did you find Japanese students? What would you say are the pros and cons of teaching Japanese people English?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and certainly a lot of people have thought about this. And I mean, I'm not really sure if pros and cons is the best way to think about this, because I mean, Japanese students are just doing their own thing. They have their own goals and intentions, and as a teacher, I'm largely there to help facilitate their learning. I think certainly the demands of the market in Japan are quite strict, and certainly it's not like some places where you can earn a huge amount of money and you can just take it easy. It's quite a hard job being an ESL teacher in Japan. I found myself working sometimes from about 9 o'clock in the morning till about 7 p.m. at night. Long days commuting around to different parts of Tokyo. The students themselves are generally a lot of the stereotypes about Japanese students, which are actually propagated by Japanese people themselves a lot of the time. A lot of them are quite true. Like Japanese students tend to be very polite, very well behaved. If you set them homework, they'll generally do it, and they'll do it to a good standard. There's a real effort made to understand what you're saying and to pay attention in class. However, students also tend to be a little bit shy and quiet, and there's a real fear of making mistakes. Part of learning a foreign language is just sometimes just blurting out whatever you think is right and just carrying on with it. But in Japan, that's really not done. So you really do have to make your lesson goals quite simple and make sure that students get plenty of practice before we do the main practice. So it gives students a lot of time to work with each other, a lot of time to prepare and practice before you go on to the final activities. I mean, I worked in pretty much all different areas of education in Japan. So I worked in elementary schools and junior high schools and universities for private companies, and as a private tutor, doing a bit of medical practice as well. So yeah, quite a broad variety. And most of the things I'm describing are true across the board. I think that certainly in Japan, you have to focus more on have quite narrow goals for your lesson and really make sure that students get a chance to practice that again and again and again. But it's a very pleasant place to live and work a lot of the time as well.
Right. So, I mean, one of the things that you said, that Japanese students are quite scared of making mistakes. So would you say that speaking is one of the primary areas that you need to work on with Japanese students, and they tend to be better with like reading, writing, and listening?
Yeah.
Would that be a fair comment?
I think that is a fair comment. Yeah, I mean, generally Japanese students are quite good at reading and writing on a sentence level. So, as part of the education system in Japan, everyone has to study English at elementary school, junior high school, and then at university. But
Right.
this is all based around translating sentences and writing short sentences. Having seen a lot of the English education at school is based around the university entrance exams, which is all about writing a 2 or 3 sentence word essay at the end of the day. So it is very much a sentence-based approach to learning reading and writing. There's not much ability to actually produce longer, coherent stretches of writing,
Right.
which is something which isn't well taught. But certainly speaking is a huge part. And as a native English teacher out in Japan, like, I think being able to speak English is the real killer. It's a real advantage. Like a Japanese teacher with good English could teach reading and writing fairly effectively, but I think a lot of Japanese learners want to learn speaking from a native speaker because they feel
Right.
there's a kind of authenticity to that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. So you mentioned motivation as well. So, I mean, in general, with Japanese students, is it a case of they're more likely to get promotion if they speak better English? So there's a kind of economic motivation, or it's more to do with being able to travel or cultural aspects? I mean, what would you say in general is the motivation of Japanese students?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And there was a good article in, I think, Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs, one of those journals, recently about the poor quality of English in Japan. Compared to other Asian countries, Japanese people have very low levels of English. I mean, compared to like China or Vietnam, for example, the
Right.
quality of English speaking ability and English production ability is quite low. And I think one of the main reasons for that, I was interested that you talked about the economic factor, because if you don't speak English in Japan, you can have a really wonderful life. I think
Right.
that you can earn a lot of money, you can travel with guides who speak Japanese to help you, you can lots of books and are translated into Japanese, so you don't have to learn it to read, you don't have to learn English to understand foreign textbooks or anything like that. Movies are dubbed, TV shows. Japan has a thriving like domestic TV industry and film industry, so there's lots of local films to watch. I'm not
Right.
sure if all of those statements are true about other Asian countries. Like I think
Right.
there is a real economic incentive to learn English in Vietnam or China, say. But also, it's generally accepted that being able to speak English is seen as something which is cool and it makes you look really smart. And you'll
Right.
see that a lot of Japanese advertisements, for example, like the main text is in Japanese, but there'll be one line at the top which is in English, normally in really simple English, often as
Right.
simple as, for example, there was a laptop company called Mouse, and their headline was "Do you know Mouse?" in English. And I
Right.
mean, it's not exactly a catchy headline, but it grabbed the attention. It's in English. It has a sort of aspirational quality to it. So
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that's definitely true. That I think some people will get promoted. Some people stand to get promoted or to move up in the company if they speak English. Certainly, a couple of major companies like Rakuten, which is a big online retailer in Japan, their company policy is to only speak English.
Okay. But that's quite unusual, though, in general in
It's
Japan.
new, yeah. It's new. A lot of the concern is not really about the ability of English ability, but about the decline of Japanese ability among learners. Because Japanese is such a complicated and like multifaceted language, there are some
Right.
worries that with the increasing number of loan words in Japanese, that more and more people are becoming less fluent in Japanese. And
Right.
certainly with the advent of computers, this is true in China and Japan, like the ability to recognize and produce the Chinese characters, which often have, like 30, 35 strokes in them, some of the more complicated ones, it becomes harder to remember if a computer will just do it for you.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the same is kind of true in English with spelling,
Oh yeah.
because you don't need to be as good at spelling as perhaps you might have traditionally been, because the computer will just spell check it for you
Yeah.
and spell it correctly.
I think
Right.
in those parts of the world though, there's more of the character has a kind of has more of a life of the word in it, whereas spelling is just simply a way of is we don't really have like an emotional connection to good spelling in the same way that you would have to good characters and good handwriting out in that part of the world.
Right.
So we regard bad spelling as a problem, but I think there's something more to how Japanese and Chinese people feel about forgetting to write their kanji in certain ways.
Right. So more of an emotional attachment in that case.
Yeah, people say out there that the kanji, for example, the Chinese letters. When I was discussing this with Japanese friends, talking about like it's so hard to remember. They say that the kanji kind of captures the essence of the word,
Right.
because often they do. If you look at them the right way, they often are reflecting what a word actually means. For example, it's hard to describe, but some of the like go, for example, the word for language includes the words for mouth and includes the character for speak in it as well. So it includes a lot of different lines which have different meanings, and combined together, they make the kanji for a word. So they kind of carry the meaning of the word in themselves.
Okay, so there's a deeper quality to the language in a certain respect than there is in, say, English.
I think so, yeah. I mean, in English has a much more pragmatic view to words, in that, the letters individually, they don't really have the same meaning as such. You combine them together to have a shared understanding of the meaning, but they don't seem to carry meaning in themselves in the same way that they do in Chinese characters and Japanese characters.
Right, great. Okay, well, I mentioned earlier that we worked together at the IPC at York University. Now, obviously, we sometimes worked in the same team, so we were teaching very similar things a lot of the time. And primarily it was academic English with Chinese students. So could you tell me a little bit about your experience of teaching academic English at university?
Yeah, done a lot of that. So we were teaching on the same course, which was largely it's a year-long course designed to get students up to speed with their academic English and their writing and speaking in particular, so that they can then go on to do their masters. So we would teach the students how to engage in seminar discussions, how to structure essays, how to write coherent paragraphs, how to paraphrase, a lot. Paraphrasing is seen as essential in the academic writing world, for good or for bad. And there's a lot of listening practice, reading practice, and so on. Basically, the way I saw it was we were trying to simulate the experience of being a master's student as much as possible, but in a very guided and controlled way, so the students had better ideas about what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, really.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, when I left about a year and a half ago, it was shortly before the COVID pandemic and shortly before everything shifted online. So it's been more than a year now that most of the courses at so many educational institutions, not just York University, that so many of them shifted online primarily. And whether they do or do not move back to real life classrooms obviously remains to be seen. But could you tell us a little bit about your experience of moving online and how you think, where you think it's worked quite well and where you think it's weaker, what's been lost and things like that?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, working online has had a lot of advantages, but also there's a few disadvantages. Certainly, I think it's been good for international education, as it's allowed students to take a British university course while they're still in China.
Right.
And for the most part, that hasn't been a problem. I've been amazed by how effectively the technology has worked.
Right.
There's a few students who have Zoom issues and things like that, but you'd expect it to be a lot more students, given that they're on the other side of the world. And also, they are expected to turn up at times which are often. We try and make the hours as sociable as possible for both parties. But if you've got like some students in China, a teacher in the UK, and then some students in South America, someone's probably going to have to get up very early to make that class.
Right.
And I think generally I've been really impressed by how devoted the students have been to it, how seriously they've taken it, and in many ways I've been surprised by just how well it's worked. Like most teachers in my experience started using various programs, but we all coalesce around using Zoom quickly, because Zoom.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not in favor of one large tech company monopolizing an area, but Zoom did just offer the best product. I'm sorry, Skype, you're doing a great job here, but I'm not sure, haven't tried you for teaching a large class.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a member of an online community, Rebel Wisdom, and and they're using Zoom, and I have to say with only one exception out of maybe, I don't know, 60, 70 or more Zoom calls, with one exception, I've never really had a problem at all.
Yeah, it's been really good so far. And also Zoom, works really well with other programs. So I mean, we've been using various Google applications like Jamboard, and recently, to be honest, we've gone back to using Google Docs as a standard way of giving students activities. So you present a standard Google document, put students into groups on Zoom, and then get the students to make a copy of the Google document, and then you can just walk around and like talk to the individual students, joining breakout rooms as it was. I found this works really well, to be honest. Like the course I'm currently teaching is entirely online and will be entirely online until it finishes in December. So I'm not sure how much, if this course carries on, I will probably continue to be teaching online for the majority of my job. And I don't really have a problem with that. I would like to go into the office so I can see people and talk to people, but I find teaching online to be absolutely fine. I find that my students have been quite hardworking and serious. It does require a different approach to teaching, though. I find that you have to plan more. There's less spontaneity to it because it's often harder to give new information which you haven't prepared. You can't just write something on the whiteboard in the same way that you could in a classroom.
Right. So when you said walking around, essentially, like if it were a normal classroom, not online, you would walk around and attend to groups of students. Yeah. But here you mean going to breakout rooms, right?
Yeah, that's interesting how I use that. But yes, certainly monitoring is probably the most important part of a teacher's work. And basically, I try and have as little whole class time as possible with my students. I put them into breakout rooms as quickly as possible and get them to work together in their groups. I then like cycle between the breakout rooms, talking to them. Often it can feel a little bit awkward, just popping in. Students are engaged in work. I pop in. Hi, how are you doing? Good. Need any help? No. All right. Bye.
Right.
It feels a bit intrusive in a way to join other people's breakout room. It's a bit of an odd arrangement. It's a bit like sending students out to a different classroom to do their work.
Right, and then dropping in with no notice, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. Perhaps perhaps Zoom could release like a sort of education edition, which could allow you to monitor all the breakout rooms simultaneously. They would clean up if they did that.
A possible suggestion for anyone working for Zoom watching.
Or Skype, if anyone's listening on the Skype HQ at the moment.
Yeah. Well, they need challenges, Zoom.
Yeah.
Great. So, I mean, what I'm kind of hearing from you is like now, obviously, you've been doing it for more than a year now, and you've got a particular way of doing it as you would do normally in a classroom. So, I mean, how long did it really take you to kind of get to grips with the different way that the dynamic worked online?
Not hugely long, actually. Like I just applied what worked in a classroom to what goes online. I realized that breakout rooms basically are groups, and most of the classwork I like to do is group work. So you put students into groups quite quickly, you work out a way of getting the work to them, and then you just get on with it, really. I find that students are quite good at filling in the gaps. So I think this is a bit of a difference with my time in Japan. I found that in Japan you had to be really careful with instructions because people would hang on your every word and follow exactly what you said. So if you gave some confusing instructions or some contradictory instructions, then that could be a problem. Whereas here, I find that my students are much more willing to fill in the gaps and just do what they think is the right thing to do when it's in front of them. So, that works well for an online setting.
Right.
The other difference with online teaching, of course, is that the classes are much shorter. There's much more emphasis on the students to do independent study work by themselves, which, as a teacher is great. I think it has exposed to us that we do need to be very clear to students about what independent study means, what they can do for independent study, what's effective independent study, how they can access resources effectively. I fear that in the past there was far too much of us just saying, go do some independent study. That's your independent study. You're supposed to do some independent study every day without really giving them much guidance about what independent study they should be doing.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're right there. I think the guidance with what they should or shouldn't be doing outside of class time was sometimes a little bit lacking, perhaps. Because obviously I have a lot of ideas about the kind of philosophy of education. So, for example, in my opinion, I think classes should be 16 students or less. Do you know what I mean? I just don't, unless you're having a lecture style class, and in which case you're going to forget kind of personal interaction. But if you're going to have a kind of interactive class, my opinion, for example, is 16 students or less. Now, is there anything in particular that you would like to talk about that you think is important?
Well, I was interested if you talk about lecture style classes because I wonder how important are lectures really? Like having large lecture halls and having everyone gather in the same space. At the moment, that's a COVID nightmare, so that's impossible. But what can you gain from being in a lecture hall with a lecturer that you can't gain from watching a video of a lecturer talk about it? I found that to be an interesting question. Certainly, if you give appropriate guiding questions and perhaps like guided readings and things like that alongside the lecture. I mean, the thing you miss, of course, is the social aspect of learning, which is a really important thing. I mean, a lot of things my students have been talking about this year have been that they miss just being able to go for a coffee with their classmates. They miss being able to talk about things together. Everything seems so formalized. And I've got friends who are doing masters at the moment, and he said, and one of my friends who's doing a master's, he says that he hasn't really got to know his course mates at all. I remember doing my own master's. There was quite a strong bond between all of us by the end of the course. We were all
Right.
struggling with the same challenges together. So I quite miss that, and I feel sorry for people who aren't getting that because that's
Yeah.
part of the fun of being at university.
Right. So, in which case, the main disadvantage that you see with the online thing is that the social element has largely disappeared from classroom teaching.
I wouldn't say, it's interesting how whether it has disappeared or not, because it gives us a huge advantage as teachers, because attendance has been really good for my course, largely because I think one of the main reasons for that is that students, they like their classmates, they enjoy talking to their classmates, and they only get to do that in classes.
Right.
So they're going to come to class, they're going to participate in class, and if they're going to speak English to each other, then great. So, I mean, that as a pandemic response, obviously there's a lot of sense in keeping people apart, but it's also straining the very human needs to interaction and company. And it's interesting what you miss. Certainly, when work from home started, I thought, great, sounds great. But now I would really like to go back into the office. Like, even though everything I can do at home. And to be honest, it would just add an inconvenient half an hour cycle ride to each half of my day. And I'll be sitting in a room which is not too great a staff room, as I'm sure you're familiar with a bunch of people who I miss. So it would be, but still, I really miss going into work. And I really
Well,
miss the social aspects. I'm sure you do too.
yeah, actually, I have to say, really, since I stopped working at York University, the main thing that I've missed, in fact, perhaps the only thing that I've really missed, is the social aspect and the
Yeah.
banter in the staff room. I miss the banter as
Mm.
well of the staff room. And I have to
Yeah.
say, being an out of work teacher, that is really pretty much the only thing I do miss is the banter in the classroom,
Yeah.
really.
You can't really have banter with the other podcasters, I guess. But anyway, going back to your question about what's things that need to change in education and the like. Um, One thing that really strikes me is that people going back to learning about English in Japan, going back to that article in Foreign Affairs I was talking about, one of the things that really struck me from that is a guy who said that he learned English at elementary school, junior high school, senior high school, and university. So he learned it for about 13 years and he can't speak a word of English. So
Right.
I think this is something, as someone who knows about learning languages, I mean, I'm not particularly great at learning languages myself. I'm interested in why some people are successful in learning languages and other people aren't. And it's clear that the way we teach and learn foreign languages in the UK in our school system just isn't really working. I don't believe there are some people who are just like naturally gifted at foreign languages and some people who aren't naturally gifted at foreign languages. That seems to me like a sort of get out answer, which allows you to stop the discussion and stop thinking about what reasons there are for why some people succeed in learning languages and some people don't succeed in learning languages. I think it would be really appropriate to investigate why, say, the Nordic countries and Scandinavian countries, Northern Europe, why they're so successful in learning English as a foreign language, and why England is so unsuccessful at learning foreign languages. Because we've all wasted time at school learning French and German. But I mean, how many of us actually speak French and German? Is it really useful? Like, it got us through the A levels, it got us through the GCSEs, but that's about it. Like, language is not a device to get you through exams. Language is a device to enable you to communicate with other people. And it's ridiculous that that's not being passed through in our language learning.
Yeah, well, actually, this is something I do have quite strong opinions on. And what you said about you don't believe that some people are good at learning languages and some people are bad, I largely agree with you. I think in general, 80 or 90 odd percent of people are capable of learning a language and don't have a particular special ability. Now,
Yeah.
every now and again, I think you're going to get people who are two, three, four, five standard deviations away from the mean who are just going to find it super easy. But in general, I think people are more or less on a kind of level playing field. And
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify what I said, perhaps it would be better rather than saying I don't believe that some people are just naturally better at learning languages. I think that that statement would require a lot of evidence, and the burden of proof is on you to prove that if you think that's true. But I haven't seen any convincing proof of yet. So I think the trouble is that it tends to shut down conversations, and it also shuts down any motivation for learning. If you're doing badly, it's like, oh, I'm not a language learner, that's fine, I've got other skills. It's like, well, if you want to learn a language, you do have to work on it. It takes time.
yeah,
I mean, there's
yeah,
been like the rise of apps like Duolingo and things like that, which are, I mean, Duolingo it's pretty flawed. It's not a perfect way, and Duolingo itself argues that it's a supplementary tool rather than the only tool you need, but it's definitely a step in the right direction because it
yeah,
encourages like active engagement, daily engagement, and it tries to make the language learning as interesting as possible, and it tries to situate it in real life situations, which is generally that's quite well informed. I gave up on Duolingo Japanese after a year after I submitted a correct answer and it told me I was wrong. I just like
right,
gave up at that point. It's like this isn't worth it anymore. But I got quite far.
right.
Interestingly enough, I can't really remember any of the stuff I learned on Duolingo though, so perhaps it doesn't work very well.
Yeah, well, I mean, in my opinion, I think the single most important factor is motivation, followed by exposure. I spent 5 years at secondary school learning French, and pretty much after, I don't know, more than 400 classroom hours, basically spoke no French. And then I learned fluent Spanish in 2 years when I went to university, aged 21, partly because I had the motivation to learn, but also I went and lived in Mexico for a
Yeah.
year. So, it was so much easier having a base in the language and then being there and getting the exposure. But that wouldn't have happened without the motivation. So,
Yeah, I mean, certainly you've both got the motivation, you've got the time as well if you're being a university student, so you've got an opportunity and you can learn Spanish in fun ways in Mexico by like going to the bar and such. But I'm sure you've
indeed.
all been there where there's that moment where you've been learning French for like 3 years at school and you think, okay, I've got a pretty good grasp on this, and you walk into the cafe and you say, Bonjour, je voudrais un boisson, s'il vous plaît. And the waiter says something incredibly fast to you, and you have no idea what they say because then you realize that the spoken language is nothing like the sentences that you've been studying at school.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say nothing like, but
Mm.
quite dissimilar due to accent and speed. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And
It's
also
true.
just the words people include, the words people omit, that sort of thing makes a
Yeah,
huge
yeah,
difference.
yeah, yeah. You are right. That is true enough. Great. Well, it was very interesting to talk to you today about your experience, both teaching in Japan, but also your experience of teaching online. And yeah, thanks for giving us your time today, James. Peace.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.